sold to a madame for the price of a whiskey bottle. A cowboy bought her free and gave her a locked door. The key was the first thing I put in her hand. Not money, not food, though she hadn't eaten. Not a word of comfort, because I didn't know how to give one that wouldn't sound like a man talking to a spooked horse. Just the key, small and iron and cold, from my vest pocket, and I set it in her palm and folded her fingers over it myself. Her knuckles were raw. She'd been fighting somebody not long before. I said, "That door at the end of the hall locks from the inside. Nobody's coming through it tonight. Nobody's coming through it any night unless you open it yourself. You understand me?" She looked at the key a long while, then she looked at me. Her eyes were this pale gray, washed-out looking, like creek water in winter, and she didn't say thank you, which I respected. She just closed her hand tighter around it and turned and walked down that hall, and I heard the bolt slide home. Good and solid. That sound right there, that bolt, was worth every dollar I'd handed that woman downstairs. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's a habit at my age. Let me go back to where it started, which was a Tuesday, which was the worst day of a bad week, which was itself the worst in a string of bad years. Though I didn't know it was about to turn yet. A man rarely does. I'd been 3 weeks on the trail down from Wyoming when I rode into Gareth's Crossing. Wasn't aiming for it specifically. Town just happened to be where the road went, and my horse needed water, and I don't know what I needed. Something. I'd been alone so long I'd started talking to the horse more than felt reasonable. Gareth's Crossing was the kind of town that had given up. You could see it in the buildings, half of them boarded, the other half leaning. One main street with a general store, a livery, a saloon, and a place called the Vermilion House. That was what it was. No church. That told you something. I wasn't looking for trouble. I want to be clear about that, because what happened could sound like I was looking for trouble. I wasn't. I was 49 years old, coming off a bad cattle season, alone since my wife Clara died the winter before, and I had maybe $60 to my name and a horse that had started favoring his left front. Trouble was the last thing I had room for. I got my horse seen to at the livery and went into the saloon for a meal and a whiskey. Just the one. I'd been careful about whiskey since Clara. She never asked me to be, but it felt like the right kind of careful. The saloon was quiet that time of day. Barkeep, 2 old men playing cards, a girl wiping tables. I ate my beans and didn't pay attention to anything until the noise started next door. At first it was just voices. Then it was a voice, a woman's, high and hard, the way a voice gets when it's done asking and started telling. Then it was that voice cut off by something heavy. I set my fork down. The barkeep didn't look up. The 2 old men didn't look up. The girl wiping tables looked up, caught my eye, and looked back down again very fast. I sat there another 30 seconds, counted them, told myself it was none of my business, told myself I had no money to spare on other people's trouble, told myself I was an old man with a lame horse and $60. Then I got up and went next door. The Vermilion House smelled like rosewater and rot. Fancy curtains in the parlor, but the floorboards underneath were soft. A woman in a green dress was sitting behind a little desk near the door, large woman, not soft, the kind of large that comes from 30 years of managing things. She had a ledger open in front of her, and she looked at me like I was an interruption. I told her I heard a commotion. She told me there was no commotion. From somewhere deeper in the building came the sound of something breaking. Glass, maybe, then quiet. I said, "Who's back there?" She said, "A business transaction is none of your concern." Now I want to say something here about what I was thinking, because I know how this sounds. It sounds like I was some kind of hero riding in. I was not. I was a tired man with $60 and a bad feeling in my stomach that I'd learned not to ignore. Clara used to say I had a sense for when something was going wrong before it went wrong. She said it like it was a gift, felt more like a burden most of the time. What I knew was this. Somewhere in that building, a woman was in a bad situation, and these people were not going to fix it. I asked the woman in the green dress what it would cost. She looked at me with pure contempt, said I didn't look like I could afford much. I said, "Try me." She picked up a bottle of whiskey from the desk, half-empty, cheap stuff, the kind you cut with water and sell to cowboys who don't know better, and she set it down in front of me. She said that's what she cost me. A man came in this morning with a girl and a story, and that's what he took for her. So that's her price. You want her, you give me the same plus 10% for my trouble. A bottle of whiskey. maybe 50 cents of actual value on a generous day. I had $60. I put 40 of it on that desk and told her to fetch the girl. Her name was Nell. I didn't know that yet. When they brought her out, she wasn't in much condition to introduce herself, split lip, one eye swollen up, dress torn at the shoulder. She stood in the parlor doorway and looked at me with no expression at all, which I understood. A woman in her position doesn't know yet whether the new man is better than the last one. She's got no reason to assume so. The woman in the green dress counted my money twice. Nell looked at my hands. People do that, check if a man's hands are fisted or open. Mine were open. I said, I've got a horse at the livery and $20 left. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to take you somewhere you can sleep, and you can decide in the morning what you want to do. That's it. That's the whole of what I'm offering. She didn't say a word, but she walked past me to the door and stood there waiting for me to lead the way. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Petch, who was approximately 70 years old and had the look of someone who had heard everything and was no longer surprised by any of it. I told her I needed 2 rooms. She looked at Nell, looked at me, named a price that was a little high. I paid it without arguing. She gave me the keys and showed us up. Room at the end of the hall for Nell, room by the stairs for me. And that's when I gave her the key, just hers, just the one for her lock. Made sure she understood it was only hers. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, and listened to the bolt slide home down the hall and let out a breath I'd been holding since the saloon. I had $20, a lame horse, no plan, nowhere particular to be. I slept better than I had in months. In the morning, she was sitting at the little table in the hall when I came out, fully dressed, hair done, sitting straight-backed with her hands in her lap. She said, "You didn't ask me anything last night." I said, "Wasn't anything I needed to know last night." She said, "You're going to ask now, though." I said, "Only if you want to tell me." She was quiet for a moment. She had that washed-out gray look to her eyes still, but they were sharper this morning, taking stock. She said her name was Nell Cutter. She'd come out from Ohio 2 years back with a man she was going to marry who turned out not to be the kind of man she'd thought he was. He'd left her in Laramie with nothing, and she'd been working her way south trying to get to her sister in New Mexico, and she'd taken up with another man in Cheyenne for the travel, and he'd turned out to be a worse kind of man still. The one who'd sold her. She told it the same way I might tell about a bad cattle drive. Flat, like the feeling had worn out of it from being carried too long. I didn't offer her any sympathy. I had a feeling she'd had enough of the kind of sympathy that was really just pity, and pity wasn't what she needed. I said, "How far is your sister?" She said, "Maybe 200 miles. I said, "My horse has a bad foot, but he'll be sound in a week. I'm not going anywhere in particular. I can take you that direction if you want to go." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Why?" I said, "Because there's no good reason not to." That wasn't quite honest. The honest reason was more complicated, and I didn't fully understand it myself at the time. Something about the way she'd stood in that parlor doorway with nothing on her face and checked my hands. Something about a woman who'd been dealt a bad hand 2 times running and was still trying to get somewhere, still moving. She said she'd think on it. The horse's name was Grady. Clara had named him, which was probably why I kept the name even though it sounded like a man's name for a horse. He was a big roan, 15 years old, good for another 5 if I didn't push him. The farrier in Gareth's Crossing found a crack in his left front hoof and said a week of rest and packing, and he'd be right. So I had a week. I spent the first 2 days staying mostly out of the way, eating at the saloon, not spending money I didn't have. Nell came down for meals. We didn't talk much. She helped Mrs. Petch with some mending one afternoon. I saw her through the window, sitting in the parlor with the old woman's sewing basket between them, working at something with her head bent. She had good hands. Quick. On the 3rd day, she came and found me at the livery where I was keeping Grady company, and she said she'd made a decision. She said she'd go with me to New Mexico, but she wanted things to be clear between us. I said, "Say what you want clear." She said, "I know what you paid for me. I know what that looks like, and I know what it usually means." She said it without flinching, looking at me straight on. She said, "I'm not payment. That's not what this is going to be." I said, "I know that." She said, "Do you?" I said, "I gave you a locked door, Nell. I meant it then. I mean it now." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once short and went back inside. And I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year, maybe longer, like I'd said exactly the right thing to exactly the right person. We left Gareth's Crossing on a Friday morning, gray sky, smell of rain coming. I had Grady and $20 and some dried beef. Nell had what she stood in and a small cloth bag Mrs. Petch had given her with some things in it. The old woman came out to see us off and looked at me with a particular look, not soft, just appraising, and said, "You're a decent man." I didn't know what to do with that. I said thank you. She said, "I don't mean it as a compliment. I mean it as a fact. They're different things." I thought about that for the first 20 miles. The road south was dry and open and long. We took turns on Grady. He was big enough to carry double, but I didn't want to push his hoof, so we spelled each other. An hour walking, an hour riding. It was slow going. It didn't seem to bother her, and it didn't bother me. She wasn't much for talking the first few days. Neither was I. We'd make camp when the lights started going, get a fire going, eat, sleep. I kept my bedroll on the other side of the fire without being asked. She noticed. She didn't comment on it, but I caught her watching me sometimes, that quiet, evaluating look like she was still deciding about me. On the fourth night she talked. We were east of the Cimarron, camped in a little hollow out of the wind. Fire had burned down to coals. She was sitting with her knees pulled up and she started talking, not at me exactly, more at the fire. She talked about Ohio. About her family's farm, her father who wasn't a bad man but wasn't strong, her mother who was strong enough for both of them but tired from it. About the man she'd come west with, his name, what he'd said to her, what she'd believed. She wasn't asking for anything, not comfort, not absolution, just saying it out loud, putting it somewhere outside of herself. I listened. I didn't say, "That's terrible," or "I'm so sorry," or any of the things that would have made it about my reaction instead of her telling. I just let her talk until she stopped. When she stopped, she poked at the coals for a minute, and then she said, "Your wife." I said, "Clara." She said, "You said her name in your sleep last night." I hadn't known that. I sat with it for a moment. She said, "What happened?" I told her fever in February fast. We'd had 22 years and one bad winter, and then I was alone. I told it flat the same way she'd told hers. It seemed right, give her the same thing she'd given me. The facts of it plain. She said, "Were you happy?" Not a question with an upswing on it, more like she just needed to know. I said, "Yeah, we were." She was quiet for a bit. Then she said, "I haven't seen much of that, happy marriages." I said, "They exist." She said, "I'm starting to think so." We came into a little settlement called Morrow about 10 days out. Not much, a trading post, a water trough, 3 or 4 homesteads scattered out in the grass. But there were people, and I needed to resupply. I left Nell at the water trough with Grady and went into the trading post. The man behind the counter, heavy-set, big gray mustache, took my order and then leaned on the counter and said, "You come in with that woman." I said yes. He said, "She's from the Vermilion house up in Gareth's Crossing." He said it the way you'd say it when you want to watch somebody's face. I looked at him. I said, she isn't now." He said, "That ain't really how it works." I said, "I'm telling you how it works. She's traveling with me. She's not what you're thinking about her, and you're going to treat her with respect when we're in this settlement, or we'll have a disagreement." He chewed on that. I'm not a big man. I was 49, lean, not imposing. But there's a thing that happens when a man says something and means every single word of it, it comes through. He'd heard it. He stepped back, finished my order, took my money. When I came out, Nell was standing by Grady watching the door. She'd seen through the window. She didn't ask what was said. She just looked at me and then looked away, and her jaw was a particular kind of set, not angry. Something else. I thought about it later and understood it was something like surprised. Still recalibrating. A woman who'd been let down enough times she'd stopped expecting anything and then kept getting something she hadn't expected. 12 days out we had weather. Not rain, worse. Wind off the plains that drove grit into everything, eyes and teeth and the collar of your coat. We hunkered down in a dry wash under a cut bank and waited it out. Grady stood with his rear to it and didn't complain. Nell pulled her coat up over her head and sat with her shoulder against mine, just to share warmth, and we stayed like that for 2 hours until the worst of it passed. Her shoulder against mine, that's such a small thing. But I noticed every inch of it and tried not to show that I noticed. She was trusting me with the length of her shoulder. You don't know what that costs a woman who's been through what she'd been through. After the wind, she was quiet for a long while. We rode and walked. Late afternoon, she said, is it much farther? I said maybe 3 more days, give or take. She said, I've been thinking about what I'm going to say to my sister. I said, what are you going to say? She said, I don't know yet. I think I'm going to say I went away and got lost and I found my way back. She paused. She said something like that. I said, that's honest. She said, it's the kind of thing you can say, and it covers everything without having to say everything. I said, yeah, it does. She looked over at me. We were walking side by side, Grady's reins loose in my hand. She said, where are you going to go? After. I said I didn't know. I'd been heading somewhere when I'd stopped in Gareth's Crossing, and I couldn't quite remember where that was now. She said, nowhere particular. I said, nowhere particular. She said, that's a sad thing. I said, I've been thinking it might be a free thing, depending on how you look at it. She was quiet again, then she said you could stay a while. In Cimarron, my sister has a place, she said it's good land, she said she could use. She stopped. I waited. She said I was going to say she could use another hand, but that's not what I was going to say. I said, what were you going to say? She stopped walking. I stopped with her. The plains were enormous and the light was going gold and Grady blew out through his nose and tried to lip my sleeve. She said I was going to say she could use good people. I could use good people. She stopped again, looked at the ground, looked back up. She said, I've been alone in bad situations for so long I forgot what it was like to not be afraid. She said, you reminded me. I didn't say anything. She said, I know you're not, I'm not asking you to be anything. I'm just saying, you reminded me it exists. I said, Nell. She looked at me, that Greywater look wide open. I said, I've been going nowhere for a year, since Clara, just going because stopping felt worse. She'd have told me that was enough of that. She wasn't one for wallowing. Nell made a sound, not quite a laugh. She said she sounds like she was something. I said she was the best thing I ever had. I said I'm not trying to replace her. She said, I know. I said, but I've been thinking since Gareth's Crossing that maybe. She said maybe. I said maybe I ride on to Cimarron and see what that looks like. She held my gaze for a long moment. Her jaw was set, but differently than at the trading post. Softer. She stepped in toward me, not all the way, just enough, and she put one hand flat against my chest. Not a reaching up thing, not leaning. Just placing her hand there like confirming something solid. Her palm against my breastbone, eyes on mine. She said that would suit me fine. I put my hand over hers, held it there a second. That was all, that was enough. Grady shook his head and stamped his good foot, and we both looked at him, and she laughed, a real one, full and a little surprised at itself. And I thought, there it is. That right there. That's the thing you go a year without, and then you hear it, and you remember what it sounds like, and something that had been locked clicks open. We reached Cimarron on a Thursday midday, the light bright and the air cool. Her sister's name was Me. She was a few years older, broader through the shoulders, hair the same color as Nell's, but without the Greywater eyes. She had dark ones, quick and watchful. She was standing on the porch of a solid little house when we came up the road, and when she saw Nell, she came down off that porch at a near run, and they held each other in the road for a long while without saying anything. I stood with Grady and looked at the land. Good grass, rolling hills, a creek somewhere to the north, I could hear it. The house was sound, the barn behind it newer, a place somebody had worked hard on. Me came over after, and she shook my hand, and she looked at me the way women look at you when they're deciding whether you're safe, quick, thorough, not unkind. She said, Nell tells me you're a capable man. I said Nell was generous. Me said she's not generous. She said she doesn't say things she doesn't mean. You should know that about her. I said I was starting to. Me said, well, she said we've got room. She looked at me clear-eyed. She said, if you're thinking of staying, there's work here and you look like a man who knows how to do it. I stayed. I want to say I stayed for the land or for the work or because I had nowhere else to be. Those things were true, but they weren't the reason. The reason was Nell, and I knew it by the third morning when I came in from the barn, and she was at the stove with her back to me, and she said, without turning around, there's coffee if you want it, and the whole morning opened up like it had always been there waiting. That's the thing nobody tells you about being alone a long time. It isn't the big ache that does you in. It's the small things you run out of. Someone knowing how you take your coffee, Someone who says your name when there's no particular reason to say it. Someone whose shoulder you know the weight of. I'm not going to dress it up into something bigger than it was those early weeks. We were careful with each other. Deliberate. Both of us had been burned by moving fast and trusting wrong, and we were too old and too tired to make those same mistakes. But there was something building between us that didn't need to be rushed because it was already there. It had been there, I think. From the morning she sat in that hallway with her back straight and her hands in her lap waiting to tell me what she wanted to be clear. Me watched it happen the way older sisters do, with a look that was half amused and half fierce, like she was daring me to let Nell down. I understood it. I didn't resent it. There was a night about 6 weeks in when a couple of men came through looking for the woman from the Vermilion house. Word from the trading post at Morrow, or somewhere like it, somebody talking, somebody always talks. They rode up to me's place, and one of them talked in a way that was meant to put the fear of consequences into me. I listened to all of it. Then I said she's not that person anymore. She's a free woman living on private land. You can carry that word back to whoever sent you. The one who'd been talking looked at me. He was bigger. He was younger. None of that was really the point. The point was I wasn't moving. I was standing in my own ground between him and that door, and I wasn't afraid of him, and he could see it. They left. Nell was behind the door. When I came in, she was standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed, and she looked at me and she said, "I heard that." I said, "Good, then you know it's handled." She said, "You're not worried." I said, "About what?" She said, "Them coming back." I said, "Let them." She held my gaze for a moment, then she uncrossed her arms. She walked over to me, not slow, not performative, just purposeful, and she took my face in both her hands the way you'd hold something you didn't want to drop. She was looking at me like she was memorizing something. She said, "I have been in bad situations for a long time with men who weren't what they said." She said, "I didn't think I'd find someone." She stopped. She tried again. She said, "I didn't know this was still something that existed." I said, "What?" She said, "A man I could stand behind and know it was safe." I put my hands over hers. They were still against my face, her palms warm. I said, "Nell," I said, "I'm not going anywhere." She said, "I know." And she stayed in my hands, and I stayed in hers. And the lamp on the table threw its yellow light across the floor, and somewhere in the house me was moving around, doing something in the ordinary way of evenings. And the whole thing, all of it, felt like something you'd spend a lifetime building toward without knowing that's what you were building toward. I think about that key sometimes, the small iron key cold in my palm. I put it in her hand and told her that door locks from the inside. And it did. And she used it. And what I didn't understand then, what took me those 3 weeks on the road and 6 weeks in Cimarron and maybe longer to understand, is that she gave me one back. Not a literal key, nothing you could hold, but a door of her own making, and she'd chosen to open it and she'd let me through. That's the thing about a woman like Nell. She'd been sold for less than the price of a decent dinner. She'd been used by men who thought owning a thing meant being owed it. And she came out the other side of all that with her will intact, with her eyes still open, still deciding. When she chose to trust me, she did it the same way she'd done everything since I'd known her, deliberately with her eyes open, nobody's hand on her back pushing her. And that meant more than I know how to say. I'm not a man who's going to talk about feelings, never have been. Clara used to say, "You love quiet and you love deep, and someday that's going to be exactly what somebody needs." And she was right. She was nearly always right about things like that. I'm an old man with a lame horse and some good land, and a woman who chose me. I'm not going to tell you that's everything. I'll just tell you it's enough. It's more than enough. It's the kind of enough that you didn't know you were missing until you had it back. The lamp light the yellow floor, her hands on my face, her voice saying, "I know." A man can live a long time on that.